All right, so at this time, I'm going to assume you've listened and watched and viewed the presentation about the words of the wiser reading signpost and have gotten a little introduction about how to spot them and what to look for. So when you spot those words of the wiser, stop and ask yourself, what's the life lesson and how might it affect the character? That's the anchor question we want to ask when we see these words of the wiser. So, as an example today, we're going to be looking at excerpts from the novel Writing Freedom by Pam Munoz Ryan. And just to give you a little introduction, if you're unfamiliar with the story, it's the story about a young girl named Charlotte who lives during the mid-1800s. Now, her parents are dead, and she lives in an orphanage. She loves horses, but the overseer of the orphanage where she lives, he forbids her to work with them simply because she's a girl. Life there is hard, and at some point she realizes that she cannot stay there, so she decides to run away from the orphanage. Let's look at a short scene here, the one where Charlotte tells a trusted older and wiser adult at the orphanage that she must escape. The friend's name is Vern, and his job at the orphanage is to take care of the horses. One of the horses is named Justice. Okay, so as we read, pay attention to those words of the wiser. Thanks, Vern. I wish I could stay with you and work with the horses, but I'd be in the kitchen and I'd be missing Justice and fretting 'cause I wouldn't get to see Charity's foal or help you name it. I know, Miss Charlotte, said Vern. You gotta do what your heart tells you. I won't ever forget you, said Charlotte. I guess I'm not likely to forget you, Miss Charlotte. Now here I'm going to stop because I've noticed that this is a scene in which an older, wiser character, in this case Vern, has offered advice to the main character, Charlotte. The advice I hear Vern giving Charlotte is, you got to do what your heart tells you. It's right there in the text. Now when authors create such a scene, we need to stop and ask the words of the wiser signpost's anchor question, which is, what's the life lesson and how might it affect the character? Now, I think that the advice or the life lesson about following your heart here, it'll be helpful to Charlotte right now and also later on, no matter what challenges she faces in the future. At this moment, those words may affect her by helping her, muster the courage to take the risk of running because that's what's in her heart. And later on, well, we'll have to, see if they come back to her later and help her again later in the story when she's faced with another challenge, whether she will follow her heart there or not. Now, since Charlotte says that she won't ever forget Vern, and he says he won't ever forget her, I'm going to bet that they won't see each other again. So it will have to be his words, his advice, that she keeps close to her. And as I keep reading, I'll discover if that's true or not. So next, Charlotte leaves the orphanage and her good friends Vern and Hayward. Okay, she eventually finds a nice older man who lets her live in his barn, and he actually begins to teach her how to drive a 6-horse stagecoach. Learning to drive the coach, though, is really hard work. So as we continue, be on the lookout for more words of the wiser. And if you spot some, don't stop there. Don't just notice them, but ask yourself the words of the wiser signpost anchor question, what's the life lesson and how might it affect the character? Let's continue. There were 6 strong horses waiting for her commands, her tug on the reins to tell them which way to go. She yelled, haw and gee to get them to bear left and right, like she did when she was riding one horse or driving just 2. She wished Hayward could see her, and Vern. Vern would have never let her get out of that wagon until she figured out the turns. Just like when he taught her to ride, he kept putting her back on Freedom, her horse, after each fall, saying, every time you fall, you learn something new about your horse. You learn what not to do next time. So here's another important place to stop because I've noticed another place where a wiser character has offered the main character some advice even if it wasn't in the moment. She's just remembering what Vern has said. Vern has told Charlotte that every time you fall, you learn something you can use, something about what not to do next time. It was right there at the end of that passage. Now, remember the question we need to ask ourselves once we find one of these life lessons? It's what's the life lesson and how might it affect the character? So take a moment. Again, even pause the video right here to think about and jot down some of your thoughts about this question. What is the life lesson here from this part of the text, and how might it affect Charlotte? Okay, so I'm guessing that some people are probably thinking about, although Vern was teaching Charlotte to ride and telling her that when she falls, she needs to learn from it and get back in the saddle, this means that whenever she fails at anything, she needs to try and learn from it and keep on trying. In other words, it's both a lesson about riding and it's a lesson about life. So let's keep reading and see if there are any other moments like these. The story is continued now, and now Charlotte is a good stagecoach driver. But on this day, someone from her past wants to ride on her stagecoach, and that upsets her. Ebenezer, the man who taught her to drive a 6-horse stagecoach, sees that she's upset, and he says, "What are you blabbering about? The mail's got to go through, same as them passengers." Ebenezer put his hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "Now listen, don't you pay them passengers no mind. You are what you are, and what you are is a fine horseman, and the best coachman I ever saw. You remember that. Under the circumstances, there ain't nothing left for you to do but your job, so get to it." Charlotte looked square at Ebenezer. Ebenezer looked square back at Charlotte and said, "You're the coachman. You're in charge, so load 'em up." Well, here we are at the end of this scene, and I've seen another Words of the Wiser signpost. Comes right at the end there, but you might also think it comes right here in the middle. I want to see if you can find this one on your own. What does Ebenezer tell Charlotte that she might remember and hold on to as good advice for the rest of her life? So take a moment right there and just kind of think about that, look back at the passage, and kind of jot down your thoughts about what is that life lesson, what's that good advice that he passes on to her, and how might it affect her? Okay, hopefully you identified something like "you are what you are," which comes from this part right there. Or maybe you came up with "ain't nothing left for you to do but your job," which comes from right there. Or maybe you even saw the "you're in charge" part right here, which comes in at the very, very end. Okay? So again, whatever you identified, take a moment, pause the video in fact, jot down your answer now that you've found it, now that you've noticed it. Jot down an answer to the signpost question, what's the life lesson and how might it affect the character? What do you think this advice means and how might it help Charlotte? So do that right now. Okay, so as long as you answer both parts of the question, what's the life lesson and how might it affect the character, you're in good shape. Just remember that with Words of the Wiser, it's often easy to identify the advice or the life lesson because it's usually a quiet scene. It's a smaller, more intimate scene with the older, wiser character, and they say only a few things. But we really need to push our thinking further and think about how it might affect the character moving forward. So let's take a moment to review what we did in this lesson. Okay, we learned about the Words of the Wiser signpost. We should be on the lookout for the scenes in which a wiser, usually older, but doesn't have to be, where a wiser character offers a main character advice that will help him or her through the moment in the story, but also through much of his or her life. Now, when you find this type of scene, you should ask yourself the question, what's the life lesson and how might it affect the character? When you can answer this question, then you're learning about what's very important in the story And that might help you think about a theme, a big picture message that the author wants us to think about. So as you read in the future, be on the lookout for the words of the Wiser Signpost. Listen to the things that your parent or guardian says to you, or listen to conversations that you hear on television or in movies and film. Adults often give kids advice, so it's likely you'll hear the words of the Wiser from your own parent or guardian, or from one on TV. And when you notice these wise words, be sure to ask, what's the life lesson and how might it affect the character? All right, so thank you very much for joining me, looking at a few examples of the words of the Wiser Signpost, and I'll see you for the next one.